Before I begin reading, let me show you this map. In the shootout at the OK Corral, which really wasn't a shootout, it was a 3-count murder, which marked the end of cheap beef prices because the cattle rustlers had been killed by the Earps. Wyatt Earp escaped wounds his entire life, but brothers Morgan and Virgil were both shot during the shootout at the OK Corral. This is a map of Tombstone, Arizona. Morgan was shot in the shoulder between 4th and 5th Streets and between Fremont and Allen. Virgil was shot at the intersection of Allen and 5th, right next to the red light district. There were 6 major elements in the Wild West, and those 6 elements are still king today. They are 1. Precious metals, gold, silver. 2. Cattle. 3. Outlaws, which are the same as cowboys. 4. Liquor. 5. Gambling. And 6. Ladies of the Night. This segment is going to deal with number 6, Ladies of the Night. I'm reading from a webpage called The Spell of the West and an article called Painted Ladies. Some of the people who were welcomed most in the wild silver camp of Tombstone were the ladies of the night. Some were part-time entertainers, hoping to strike it rich. Others were simply ladies of joy trying to make enough to retire and live respectably. And others, of course, were just mercenary. The arrival of these painted ladies were welcomed with wild celebrations. Their presence and their fancy houses added a bit of refinement. The women themselves offered pleasure, amusement, and companionship to the lonely men, as respectable women had not yet arrived. Many of the ladies of Sen assisted in the making of history in the roaring camp of Tombstone during the turbulent 1880s. Big Nose Kate is believed to have been the first madam to arrive in Tombstone. Her foremost claim to fame was as girlfriend of Doc Holliday. She was the only woman who was ever to come into his life in the West. Doc met her while he was dealing cards in John Shancy's saloon in Fort Griffith, Texas. She was what she was and made no bones about it. Big Nose Kate Elder, a dance hall girl and prostitute. True, her nose was prominent, but her other features were quite attractive. Her curves were generous and all in the right places. Tough, fearless, high-tempered, and stubborn. Kate was a prostitute because she liked being a prostitute. She belonged to no man and was controlled by no madam, but operated as an individual in any manner she chose. Kate kept Doc from decorating a hang tree in Fort Griffith, and for that he was eternally grateful. The two of them lived together for a while, but the quiet life was not for Kate. She went back to the bright lights and excitement of the dance halls and gambling dens. Still, when Doc headed west, Big Nose Kate followed him to Tombstone. She arrived in the same stage with Rowdy Kate Lowe and her common-law husband, Joe Lowe. All 3 of them had been invited to leave Dodge City or else. Doc found Kate living quarters sandwiched between a funeral parlor and the Somo Winery on the north side of Allen at 6th Street. Soon after her arrival in the town too tough to die, Kate went into business. She bought a large tent, rounded up several girls and a few barrels of whiskey, and opened Tombstone's first sporting house. Her partners in this venture were Joe and Rowdy Kate Lowe. Their only rule was to make sure that no one left the premises carrying any money. The manner in which they separated the customers and their cash was unimportant. Money rolled in so fast from the reckless miners that Kate bought a frame house at the edge of town. Business was even better here. She served the worst whiskey in the territory, and her prices were determined by how drunk she thought the customer was. Kate and the Lowes made a business of putting knockout drops in the drinks of customers who were foolish enough to flash a bankroll. The victim was robbed, then thrown into a wash behind the house to sleep it off, and later wonder what happened. Doc and Kate began living together again, but Doc continued his drinking and gambling, and Kate her business as a prostitute and madam. One night she got drunk and became unusually profane and abusive. Doc had had enough, so he threw her out, bag and baggage. In her angry desire to get revenge on Doc, she swore that Doc had been involved in a stagecoach holdup. Doc had enough witnesses as to his whereabouts on the date in question to clear him. However, that was the end of the line, as far as he was concerned. He gave her $1,000 and put her on a stagecoach leaving town. This paid his debt to her in full. He never saw Big Nose Kate again. By 1881, ladies of joy were quite numerous in Tombstone. A number of the more attractive prostitutes worked as performers at the Birdcage Theater. Older and less attractive women worked the dance halls and saloons, caging drinks from customers for which they received a percentage. Almost all the night ladies lived in cribs or houses on 6th Street, which was a restricted area. All the girls made money at their profession because women were scarce and their favors were much in demand. Several times a year, traveling shows arrived in town, and the showgirls took a large slice of the prostitutes' business, at least temporarily. Probably the best remembered of the showgirls is Lisette, the flying nymph. Lisette was an unusually beautiful girl, and her act was simply that of floating over the stage, supported by wires so small that they could not be seen by the audience. Apparently Lisette had unseen problems as she became a confirmed alcoholic and soon disappeared from Tombstone into the limbo of time and history. May Davenport was another who arrived with a traveling carnival. She quickly left show business when she saw that a woman with beauty, brains, and no moral character could name her own price in the old silver camp. She abandoned Tombstone when the big copper boom hit Cananea down in Old Mexico. There she opened a fancy sporting house that was soon known as May's Place. It was famous for its beautiful women and plush atmosphere all over the West. Along in 1884, the French moved in on Tombstone's prostitution business. It was apparent that the houses were controlled by a well-organized syndicate. The first madam they sent to Tombstone was a lovely young woman known as Blonde Marie. She was a very good businesswoman, and strictly a madam who did not indulge in the business under any circumstances. Marie's place of business was a large white house on 6th Street. She ran her place with pride and quiet dignity. Every girl employed by her was French and exceptionally attractive. There was no bar, no drunks, and no fights, and she only entertained the high-class gentlemen. Her girls were exchanged frequently, so the men of Tombstone had no opportunity to tire of the merchandise offered them. By the mid-1890s, Blonde Marie had made and saved enough money to live in the style she desired. She retired and returned to France. Another madam the French sent to Tombstone was Madame Mustache. She was given that name because of the dark hair growing on her lip. This female was no beauty, and she did not have the elegance of Blonde Marie, but she knew her business and did well as a madam. When she felt that Tombstone was fading, she packed up all of her girls and went to San Francisco. The manager of all the French madams and their houses was a man called the Count. He appeared in Tombstone approximately every 3 months, checked on business, brought new girls, and took the old ones to other towns. A direct contrast to the elegant French madams and prostitutes was Crazy Horse Lil. She was big, she was tough, and she knew and used language that would make a Barbary Coast sailor blush. Her greatest pleasure was to get roaring drunk and start a fight. She had no preference. She would fight man, woman, or beast. A great deal of her time was spent in jail for disturbing the peace or breaking up the fixtures in saloons. When she left Tombstone, she settled in Brewery Gulch in Brisbee. The miners at Brisbee and Lowell loved her Amazon good looks and her rough style. Consequently, she made money hand over fist. Sad to say, Lil and her gentleman friend of the moment, Conochea, grew greedy and masterminded a number of local robberies. When the law drew close, they both disappeared from Arizona and were never seen again. One of Tombstone's most unusual sometime prostitute was Big Minnie. Her husband was Joe Binion, manager of the Birdcage Theater. She often performed there, and Joe billed her as Big Minnie, 6 feet tall and 230 pounds of loveliness in pink tights. She frequently acted as a bouncer, too. The Binions arrived in Tombstone in 1881, and they were employed by Billy Hutchinson, the owner of the Birdcage. But when Billy left Tombstone, they bought it from him. By 1890, the boom was over. Tombstone was dying. The Binions sold the Birdcage and bought the Crystal Palace. Soon after, gold was discovered nearby in Pierce, and business really faded in the old silver camp. A portrait of Fatima, who belly danced to acclaim at the Birdcage in 1882. Tombstone After Dark. A combustible mix of women and whiskey. One of Tombstone's most raucous and combustible night spots was the Birdcage Theater, which offered a smorgasbord of delights ranging from imported vaudeville acts to prostitution. The smoke-filled establishment was named with heavy frontier humor for the 12 tiny balcony boxes where soiled doves plied their trade behind curtains when uncaged. The painted ladies pursued less profitable sidelines, such as shilling drinks and dancing with drunk cowboys, hard-handed miners, and nimble-fingered gamblers and gunmen. The theater's owners, Billy and Lottie Hutchinson, prudently requested that incoming patrons check their hardware. Observance of the rule was uneven at best. Before long, more than 100 bullet holes dappled the theater's ceiling, walls, and even the huge painting hung in tribute to the popular performer named Fatima. The casualties in all this gunplay were never toted up, though one visitor claimed to have witnessed a single shootout that left 12 men dead. Whatever the true tally, performers and patrons alike had good reason to fear for their safety. Once, a second-rate magician named Charles Andress told his audience that he could catch bullets in his teeth. As an assistant fired blank cartridges, he spit out the slugs he had concealed in his mouth. Suddenly, a besotted customer drew his six-gun and shouted, "Catch this one, Professor!" A quick-thinking spectator jogged the man's arm, and the shot went astray, leaving the quaking target to make his exit with a minimum of dignity and a maximum of haste. Minnie and Joe went to Pierce and opened Joe Bignon's Palace. Many people from Tombstone were already at the new gold camp, and several entire houses were moved from Tombstone to Pierce. Even the first man killed in Pierce was from Tombstone. Both Big Minnie and Joe lie in eternal rest in the cemetery in the ghost town of Pierce. On some occasions, the arguments of the girls in the red light district ended in violence. Such was the story of Gold Dollar, or Little Gertie. Little Gertie, the Gold Dollar, was the trade name of a 6th Street prostitute. It is quite possible that this name came about because at the time the U.S. Mint was producing a coin that was smaller than a dime and valued at $1. As her name indicated, the girl was of diminutive stature and had golden yellow hair. It was also well known that the tiny girl had to be assessed strictly in monetary terms. The women of Tombstone's heyday were quite sensitive about their men, and Gold Dollar was no exception. She had taken a fancy to a local tin-horn gambler, Billy Milgreen, and fully intended that no other woman get her hands on him. They were living together, and Billy was considered Gold Dollar's man by the denizens of the red light district. That is, up until Margarita came to town. She was tall, dark, and willowy, a direct contrast to the tiny Gold Dollar. The Mexican prostitute took one look at Billy Green and began to move in on Gold Dollar, although she knew the relationship between Billy and the little dance hall girl. Billy, when taken to task by Gold Dollar, solemnly promised that he would have nothing whatsoever to do with the sultry Margarita. One evening, Billy felt the urge to play a few hands of poker, and after much persuasion, Gold Dollar agreed to let him do so, providing he stay away from Margarita. Billy promised and headed for the birdcage, where a game was already in progress. Actually, Billy was sincere in his promise to Gold Dollar, because he took a seat and was apparently interested only in the fortune of his cards. Still, Margarita miffed because Billy ignored her, teased and flirted with him while he played poker, and she was an attractive girl. Gold Dollar, who was working at the Crystal Palace, was not entirely convinced that her boyfriend was going to be the angel he had promised to be. Therefore, she was soon back in front of the birdcage doors, where she could glimpse Billy as each customer entered or left. As fate would have it, she looked in to see Margarita strutting around the table teasing Billy. Suddenly she plopped herself down in Billy's lap and began kissing him. That was all Gold Dollar needed. She burst into the room and screamed, "Get away from him, you chippy! I've warned you before." She grabbed a handful of Margarita's long hair and yanked her away from Billy. The Mexican girl fought back with sharp nails and flying feet, but she was no match for her infuriated adversary. Gold Dollar pushed Margarita over a table, then reached for her knife and her garter. Raising the wicked blade high, she stabbed Margarita in the side. Margarita was dead by the time the doctor reached her. No action was ever taken against Gold Dollar, but she soon disappeared from Tombstone. One prostitute, Irish Mag, was much more fortunate than most of the Tombstone ladies of joy. While entertaining a customer one night, she was quite surprised when the man unexpectedly asked her to grub stake him so he could go prospecting. Mag had never seen the man before, but on impulse she dug into her meager savings to loan him the money. The prospector took the money and left, neglecting to pay her for her favors. She berated herself for some time for lending money to a complete stranger. After a while she decided that the money was gone, and that was that. Several months passed, and one day the stranger returned. Mag was stunned when he told her that he had struck it rich and that $500,000 now rested in Wells Fargo, deposited in her name. Irish Mag quit the business, took her money, and returned to Belfast, Ireland, to live respectably the rest of her life. During the height of the silver boom, there were several hundred Chinese in the old camp. A fat, healthy Chinese woman who wore heavy, expensive silks and rare jewelry was the absolute ruler over all the Oriental population. She was known as China Mary and was married to Alom, a partner to Kwong Ki in the Can restaurant. China Mary not only controlled Hoptown, but virtually owned every Oriental in Tombstone, life, body, and soul. Her word was undisputed law. Practically all the cooking, washing, and house cleaning was accomplished through Chinese labor. If any person wished to hire a houseboy, servant, or a Chinese prostitute, they went to China Mary and made the necessary arrangements. No Chinese in Tombstone could be hired except through her. Not only did she hire them out, but she guaranteed their honesty and willingness to work. Mary handled all the narcotics in Tombstone and the peddling of human flesh that was done in the Chinese section. She also operated a store where she sold Chinese delicacies and objects of art. In addition, she ran Chinese gambling games, mostly Fantan, in the back of her store. She was influential in Tong affairs and was most likely connected with the 6 companies of San Francisco. In addition, she owned several opium dens and supplied opium to the girls in the red light district uptown. Regardless of all her shady operations, China Mary was respected and well-liked in Tombstone. She loaned money to any who impressed her as honest and hard-working. No sick or injured person was ever turned from her door. At her death, she was buried in the Chinese section of Boot Hill. One of the Tombstone madams earned the title Queen of the Red Light District. She was Dutch Annie, the belle of Silver Boomtown and friend to everyone. Although she was a soiled dove, Annie was looked upon as a camp angel. Numerous times she was known to take a miner down on his luck and give him a new start in life. When she died, all Tombstone mourned and turned out to bury her in Boot Hill with dignity and splendor. Prominent businessmen and citizens, along with members of the underworld and girls of the Red Light District, attended her funeral. Over 1,000 buggies followed her to her final resting place. Like almost all Tombstone ladies of sin, no one ever knew her real name. Consequently, her grave is marked with a simple epitaph which reads, Dutch Annie, 1883. These lusty-busty women were a part of the history of Tombstone, equally as important as the prospectors, the gamblers, and the ranchers. Many a man had the ladies of sin to thank for the stake that started them out. The Spell of the West, Painted Ladies. Before I begin reading, let me show you this map. In the shootout at the OK Corral, which really wasn't a shootout, it was a 3-count murder, which marked the end of cheap beef prices because the cattle rustlers had been killed by the Earps. Wyatt Earp escaped wounds his entire life, but brothers Morgan and Virgil were both shot during the shootout at the OK Corral. This is a map of Tombstone, Arizona. Morgan was shot in the shoulder between 4th and 5th Streets and between Fremont and Allen. Virgil was shot at the intersection of Allen and 5th, right next to the Red Light District. There were 6 major elements in the Wild West, and those 6 elements are still king today. They are 1. Precious metals, gold, silver. 2. Cattle. 3. Outlaws, which are the same as cowboys. 4. Liquor. 5. Gambling. And 6. Ladies of the Night. This segment is going to deal with number 6, Ladies of the Night. I'm reading from a webpage called The Spell of the West and an article called Painted Ladies. Some of the people who were welcomed most in the wild silver camp of Tombstone were the ladies of the night. Some were part-time entertainers, hoping to strike it rich. Others were simply ladies of joy trying to make enough to retire and live respectably. And others, of course, were just mercenary. The arrival of these painted ladies were welcomed with wild celebrations. Their presence and their fancy houses added a bit of refinement. The women themselves offered pleasure, amusement, and companionship to the lonely men, as respectable women had not yet arrived. Many of the ladies of sin assisted in the making of history in the roaring camp of Tombstone during the turbulent 1880s. Big Nose Kate is believed to have been the first madam to arrive in Tombstone. Her foremost claim to fame was as girlfriend of Doc Holliday. She was the only woman who was ever to come into his life in the West. Doc met her while he was dealing cards in John Shancy's saloon in Fort Griffith, Texas. She was what she was and made no bones about it. Big-nosed Kate Elder, a dance-hall girl and prostitute. True, her nose was prominent, but her other features were quite attractive. Her curves were generous and all in the right places. Tough, fearless, high-tempered, and stubborn. Kate was a prostitute because she liked being a prostitute. She belonged to